Today we're counting down 5 of the most brutal and unbelievable combat stories to ever come out of the modern battlefield. These are the missions that went sideways, the moments where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. None of this is fiction. Every one of these stories happened, and by the end, you won't think about war the same way again. In the spring of 2003, the coalition invasion of Iraq was tearing across the desert at speed. British forces were pushing north alongside the Americans, and somewhere in southern Iraq, there was an Iraqi armored division, roughly 4,000 soldiers, tanks, artillery, the whole lot, all sitting in a defensive position along a main supply route. Coalition commanders needed to know what they were dealing with, how many vehicles, what condition the road behind them was in, and whether these guys were dug in and ready to fight. The job went to Pathfinders, a reconnaissance unit within the British Parachute Regiment. Small teams, light footprint. Their entire purpose was to go places nobody else could go, see things nobody else could see, and get back without anyone knowing they were ever there. One particular team leader, a soldier named Christian Craighead, had been waiting for this. He'd been held back by his commanding officer since they'd crossed the border, told he was going to be saved for the right job, which sounds flattering until you're watching every other team go out while you sit at the headquarters cleaning your weapon for the 3rd time that day. So when the brief came through of a close target reconnaissance mission on an Iraqi armored division which had very high probability of enemy contact and no guaranteed air support, he didn't hesitate. His CO actually gave him an out, told him straight, "There's a high chance you don't come back from this one. You don't have to take it." He took it. But here's the thing. The full 6-man team was too many bodies, too much noise, too much movement for what they needed to do. So he made a call. He'd go in with just 2 others, 3 men walking on foot into the middle of 4,000 enemy soldiers. He chose his second-in-command, a brilliant sniper named Patty, and a soldier called Larry. Larry was a guy built for exactly this kind of chaos, who carried a belt-fed machine gun. Between the 3 of them, they had a sniper rifle, an assault rifle with a grenade launcher, the machine gun, hand grenades, and pistols. As much firepower as 3 men could physically carry. The plan was straightforward. A sponsor patrol would drive them to a release point, and from there, the 3 of them would move on foot toward the Iraqi positions under cover of darkness. Patty's role was overwatch. Patty would set up in an overwatch position with his sniper rifle, while Craighead and Larry would push forward on their own, just 2 men. They would get eyes on the enemy vehicles, count them, assess the road, and pull back before dawn. That was the mission. They blacked out their faces, not standard camouflage cream patterns, full black, an old trick passed down from a veteran of the Special Forces. The idea was simple. If you come face to face with the enemy at close range in the dark, a blacked out face buys you a half second of confusion, and in close quarters, a half second is everything. On the first night, the mission is cancelled due to one of the vehicles in the sponsor patrol rolling over and badly injuring an officer, so the mission scrubbed. They'd have to try again the next night. The second night came around, and everything went clean. They reached the release point. The 3 of them stepped off the vehicles and disappeared on foot into the darkness toward 4,000 Iraqi soldiers. They began advancing, but the terrain was brutal. Thick mud mounds, one after another, like someone had plowed the desert into ridges. They were burning through time and energy, and at this rate, they wouldn't reach their target before sunrise. And being caught in the open in daylight, 3 men against an armored division, was a death sentence. The team leader Craighead made a decision. He knew the rules. You never walk on tracks. Tracks are predictable. Tracks are where the enemy watches. But the terrain was going to kill the mission anyway. So he pulled his 2 men in and laid it out. They'd get on a nearby track, move fast, use a set of power lines crossing overhead as a marker, and then break off into the desert toward the enemy position. Both men agreed. It was the right call. Craighead took point, Larry with the machine gun behind him, and Patty at the rear with the sniper rifle. They moved in single file down the track, night vision goggles glowing green, the only sound their own breathing and the soft crunch of boots on packed earth. On the right side of the track, there was a raised berm, a wall of hard-packed dirt about 6 feet high running parallel to them. Standard in that part of the world, farmers typically used them as boundaries. Military units used them as cover. They were approaching the power lines, almost time to break off the track and head toward the objective. But then Craighead stopped for a moment to adjust his backpack, and in that half second of stillness, he heard something. On the other side of the berm, which was no further than 10 feet from him, people talking quietly in Arabic. He turned his head slowly toward the sound. Then, without making a noise, he gave the hand signal behind him. Thumb down, which means enemy. He points to where they are. Larry stopped instantly and swung his weapon toward the threat, while Patty closed the gap silently from the rear. 8 yards. That's how far away the voices were. The length of a living room. He could hear the conversation, but not see the speakers. The berm was between them. So Craighead crept to the edge of the berm and looked over the top with his night vision goggles. On the other side, huddled together in the green glow of his optics, he managed to roughly count 8 to 12 Iraqi soldiers, all armed. Some talking quietly, some sitting. Craighead believed they were using the power lines as a reference point, the same way he had. This was a standing patrol, a sentry position. He pulled back down and whispered the count to his men. And in that moment, as he went to tell his teammates the situation, whether the Iraqis heard his voice or his movement, one of the Iraqi soldiers stood up and looked over the wall. Craighead didn't think. He reached up, leaned over the berm, and fired a single shot, dropping the Iraqi soldier. He reached for his rifle, but it jammed. The cocking handle had caught on his loose jacket as the bolt cycled. The weapon was dead in his hands, but with no hesitation, his hand went straight through his vest, and he pulled a high-explosive grenade, vaulted the berm, and threw it down into the cluster of Iraqi soldiers. The detonation ripped through the position. It did damage, but there were still threats, still movement, still weapons. He drew his pistol, re-peeked the berm, and dropped 5 more enemy insurgents. All while behind him, Larry was laying fire into flanking positions with his machine gun, and Patty was throwing grenades at depth, cutting off any chance of reinforcement reaching them. And then it was over. That fast. Craighead cleared his rifle stoppage, fired a 40mm grenade beyond the position to discourage anyone from following, and gave the order to move. They bounded back toward the extraction point, one man covering while the other 2 ran, leapfrogging in pairs through the darkness. They reached the emergency extraction point and set up a defensive position. Patty aimed his sniper rifle down road, and the 3 men, they waited. And here's the part that says everything about who these men were. Christian said, as they crouched in the dark, waiting for their ride. Larry was quietly cursing under his breath, not because they'd nearly died. He was angry that the Iraqis weren't chasing them. Larry wanted the armored division to mobilize. He wanted them to come. 3 men against 4,000. And he was irritated they weren't getting around to. Eventually, the sponsor patrol arrived, and they were all extracted back to headquarters. And the next night, all 3 of them went back again. In September 2013, a group of gunmen walked into the Westgate shopping mall in Nairobi, Kenya, and opened fire. Over 4 days, 67 people were killed and more than 170 were wounded. It was one of the worst terrorist attacks in East African history, and the mastermind behind it became one of the most wanted men on the continent. And American intelligence eventually tracked a key figure connected to the attack. They tracked him to a compound near the coast of Somalia. The mission was to capture him. The mission was classified at the highest level. President directed. That's the top of the chain. The kind of operation where the commander-in-chief personally authorizes the action. And this particular mission was handed to one of the most experienced assault teams in the world, a SEAL Team 6 element led by an operator named DJ Shipley. DJ Shipley was the son of a SEAL and was raised in the shadow of Virginia Beach's special operations culture. He was forged into one of America's most elite warriors and served his country for 17 years between SEAL Team 10 and the Naval Special Warfare Development Groups, the unit most known as SEAL Team 6. The intelligence for the mission painted a picture. It was a beachside bungalow. The target goes there to relax and watch television. It has low security. It was an in and out mission. That was not the case. It began with the assault team swimming into the target. That alone is worth understanding for a moment. This wasn't a pleasant evening dip. Their infiltration route took them through a slaughterhouse outflow, an underwater channel where animal waste drained into the ocean, which meant the water was thick with the kind of smell that attracts exactly the thing you don't want circling you in the dark ocean off the coast of East Africa. Sharks. Shipley would later say it was the fastest he'd ever swum in his life. The team managed to reach the compound without getting eaten by sharks. Immediately, Shipley went up and over the perimeter gate and started working the locking mechanism. While doing so, he noticed a string tied to the gate, running from the latch through a gap and disappearing inside the building. This was an early warning device, probably attached to a bell. Shipley got the gate open and brought the full team inside the courtyard, and as they moved toward the front door, gunfire erupted. Contact. Gunfire started raining down from the roof, a round skipping off one of the operator's helmets. And then, the entire building came alive. This was not a bungalow. This was a fortress. It was 3 stories tall. Every doorway was walled up from the inside. There were no windows to enter through, and the front door was 6 inches of solid wood, with what looked like a railroad tie braced behind it as some sort of locking mechanism. The intelligence had been wrong about everything. These people had been preparing for this exact scenario for a long time. Shipley placed his explosive charge on the front door, but to do it, he had to time the gaps between the bursts of automatic fire coming through the door from inside. The shooter on the other side was unloading full magazines through the wood with pure hate. You could see the splinters exploding outward, tracers ripping through. 3 seconds of fire, silence. 3 seconds of fire, silence. In the gap, he slapped the charge onto the door and pressed himself against the wall. There was nowhere to take cover, no room to roll. The only option was to eat the blast. He turned his head, exhaled, and detonated it. The overpressure from that blast blew out everyone's eardrums. Every man on that porch was immediately concussed, blood coming out of their noses. The world reduced to a high-pitched ring. But despite all that the door hadn't blown open, the makeshift railroad tie lock had held. The blast only blew out a narrow slit, waist high, and grenades started coming through it. Behind that door was a long hallway At the end of it, a man in a sandbagged position behind a belt-fed machine gun, raking fire down the corridor. And in the first room off the hall, another enemy fighter was shooting through a window, catching the operators in a crossfire. And through it all, the standing order: bring the target back alive. The command had been explicit before they launched. The exact words passed down were, "I would rather you shoot him 100 times and he lives than shoot him one time and he dies." They traded grenades back and forth with the defenders. The operators on the upper floors and the roof were in identical situations, pinned, under fire, locked in close quarters combat in a building designed to be unbreachable. And then the men got word that the enemy's quick reaction force was on the way. Pickup trucks mounted with heavy weapons were inbound. They were about to be surrounded. The team leader DJ made the call. They had to leave. The target was not going to be captured. But the only way out was back through the courtyard and out the gate, which meant running directly past the hallway where the machine gunner was still firing. His kill zone was the only exit. They had to come up with a plan fast. One of the operators had a thermobaric charge, an overpressure weapon designed to collapse enclosed spaces. They'd split the loadout across the team because of the swim-in, so the charge was down in the courtyard with another operator. So in the middle of a gunfight, with machine gun fire chewing up the walls around them, they did something that would later be described as a real-world flea flicker. The operator in the courtyard threw the charge across the open doorway. Shipley caught it mid-air, untaped it, and launched it down the hallway toward the machine gun position. He called out to the team, "When this goes off, everybody runs." The explosion was massive. The overpressure blew him off the porch, and every man in that courtyard took off at a dead sprint for the gate. The first operator didn't even bother trying to open it. He just shouldered through it and blew it off its hinges. And through it all, behind them, the machine gunner never stopped firing. Through the thermobaric blast, through everything, the belt fed just kept going. Nobody knows how. And it doesn't stop there, because the extraction was as bad as the assault. The surf was rough, so the boat meant to pull them out rolled in the wave break and flipped. So operators were towed behind Zodiacs on ropes, which resulted in DJ dislocating both his shoulders. A jet ski also flipped, blowing out one man's hip. Men who had just survived a fortress assault were now bobbing in shark-infested water off the Somali coast. Can it get much worse? When they finally made it back and were stripped for medical examination, the medics found something strange. Metal shavings everywhere. Inside their ears, under their eyelids, embedded in every fold of skin and clothing. Fragments from the grenades and explosions, but none of it had penetrated deep enough to cause lethal wounds. One operator would later describe it simply. It was like something reached down and said, "Not today." Days later, back at base, Shipley was lying on his rack with sunglasses on in a dark room. He couldn't remember his wife's name. He couldn't remember his daughter's name. He got lost driving to work on a route he'd driven 1,000 times. Something wasn't right. So he went for a CT scan, which showed the back of his skull was jet black. A massive brain trauma from the overpressure of his own breaching charge. The one he detonated at arm's length to try to open a door that refused to open. The doctor asked him what had hit him in the back of the head. Nothing had. It was the shockwave alone. He'd come home to a 6-month-old baby girl who'd never met her father. And now her father couldn't remember her name. The outpost was small, just a cluster of mud buildings surrounded by blast walls and sandbags in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. It was the kind of place where you could count every person inside the perimeter and still have fingers left over. There were 3 American special operators living there. One of them a MARSOC Raider named Prime Hall, an Army infantry squad, an Afghan special forces team and their interpreters, and that was it. The main team, with all the reinforcements and heavy equipment, was based at a larger compound about a kilometer away, through a green zone that was laced with IEDs, close enough to technically be support, but far enough that if something went wrong, you were on your own for a while. Hall had built a routine out of the chaos. He trained Afghan local police in the area, made deals with the Army SF team to share manpower, and spent his mornings handling the revolving door of Afghan commanders who would show up at the gate wanting something. On this particular day, it was Ramadan, and the heat was unbearable. Over 130 degrees on the worst days. The kind of heat where just walking from your bunk to the kitchen felt like an athletic event. That morning, he'd been woken up early, again, by one of the Afghan local commanders who kept showing up at the gate, causing problems. Hall went out and told him to leave. The man did, reluctantly. Prime then walked to the little camp kitchen next to where the interpreters lived, grabbed a bowl of cereal, and sat down at a picnic table in the morning sun. He was wearing board shorts, a tank top, sunglasses pushed up on his head, and a Glock in a holster clipped to his waistband. Because even at breakfast, even inside the wire, you kept your weapon. But everything else about this moment was as close to as normal as it gets in a combat zone. Cereal, morning heat, the quiet hum of another day starting. Then the world detonated. All of a sudden, he was on the ground, on his back, behind the interpreter's building, but he had no idea how he'd gotten there. He began holding his eyes open with his fingers, prying them apart, because everything was black, and he was convinced he'd been blinded. But luckily that wasn't the case. His sunglasses, they'd been on his head. They'd been blown over his eyes by the blast. That's why he couldn't see. Not blind, just knocked sideways by an explosion that had launched him off a picnic bench and scrambled his brain. He couldn't make sense of anything. His first thought was maybe the Polaris, a little utility vehicle parked next to the picnic table, had exploded. Some kind of IED detonation made sense in that moment. Nothing else did. When his vision started to clear, still on the ground, he saw something that didn't fit. The Afghan Special Forces team chief, the experienced sergeant he'd been training with for weeks, was dropping a bag full of RPG rounds and sprinting away. Then another Afghan SF soldier ran out of the compound gate, in broad daylight, into the village, which never happened. Nobody went out there in daylight. It was a death sentence. Prime managed to drag himself to the interpreter's quarters. Whilst inside, the interpreters, men he knew well, men he worked with every day, were holding hands in a circle, eyes wide. Big problem, they said. Big problem. He knew he had to move, so he crawled to the operations center, a small bunker covered with sandbags. And the moment he got inside, an RPG hit the roof directly above him, then another, then another. The shooter was somehow in the guard tower, right on top of them, one of their own security positions. There were 3 or 4 men inside that operations center. Every time a rocket hit the sandbags overhead, the concussion slammed through them like a car crash. One man was under the desk. The other 3 just stood there and took it, over and over. A total of 12 RPGs were fired from that tower. 12. In a space not much bigger than a garden shed. Every piece of equipment, cameras, communications, tech systems, was destroyed. Shrapnel was embedded in everything. The picnic table, where he'd been eating cereal minutes ago, looked like it had been through a car crusher. And then, out of nowhere, an army infantryman came running over and said the words that finally made everything make sense. One of the Afghan Special Forces guys has gone crazy in the tower. He needs to be killed. Up until that moment, nothing made sense. But now, everything did. It was an insider attack. One of their own had betrayed and turned on them. Now the situation had changed completely. If one of them had turned, who else had turned? Nothing inside the perimeter could be trusted. They had to clear every room, every building, every position, while RPGs were still raining down on them from a tower they'd built for their own protection. The operators cleared the compound, and when they reached the back, they found the Afghan Special Forces soldiers, the same men with the long beards who'd looked so impressive in training, handing over their rifles. They were done, because 3 of their own teammates were dead on the ground, so they quit then and there on the spot. The shooter had killed their captain. When the Afghan captain realized what was happening and climbed up his own team's living space to get an angle on the tower, the shooter put a round through his head the moment he appeared. Another soldier who tried to approach the tower by the stairs had been shot and killed and was lying on the steps. The tower itself had become a death chamber, but not just for the people outside it. The shooter had been firing RPGs from an enclosed armored position, not an open tower, a sealed ballistic post designed to stop bullets from getting in, which meant the backblast from every rocket he fired had nowhere to go. 12 rockets in an enclosed space, the post was on fire. The shooter was burning alive inside his own position, so finishing the job wasn't too hard for operators to complete. They began calling it Ghost Post after that. Prime Hall, the one who'd been eating cereal when the first RPG landed close enough to pepper his breakfast with shrapnel, was medevaced for a concussion, loss of consciousness, and a traumatic brain injury. But the thing that kept him up at night wasn't the explosion. It wasn't the shrapnel. It wasn't even the concussion. It was the realization that the one place he'd felt safe, the inside of his own compound, inside his own walls, surrounded by people he thought were on his side, had tried to kill him. His security bubble, the thing his mind depended on to function in a place where everything outside the wire wanted him dead, had shattered from the inside. And you can't get that back. Once the place you sleep doesn't feel safe anymore, nothing does. They had taken down the target building without issue. Standard operation. Helicopters in, secure the objective, process the site. A good night's work. The kind of mission that makes you think you might actually get some sleep. But then the snipers called it in. They'd been watching the perimeter from an elevated position, and they'd just observed 5 military-aged males sprint out of a nearby house, about 150 yards away, cross a road and disappear into a thick patch of vegetation. That's not normal. Not at that hour. Not when helicopters have just landed and a target's been rolled up. If you're a civilian, you stay inside. You lock your door. You don't run out of your house and into a field unless you have a reason. A Navy SEAL by the name of Jason Redman was told to take 9 of his guys, including DJ Shipley, and push up to that vegetation to find out who these men were. The terrain was specific. The target house sat near a bend in a road that curved like an S. Beneath the curve, there was a large, dense field of vegetation. North of that, nothing. Thousands of yards of flat, empty desert. They had a gunship overhead. That was their safety net. Things had gotten so dangerous on this deployment that a gunship was now a go, no-go requirement. No aircraft, no mission. Period. Redmond pushed his team into the vegetation, and immediately something felt wrong. The bush was so thick that night vision was useless, just a green blur. Every step crackled, every branch snapped. They couldn't see, and they couldn't move quietly. It was like trying to sneak through a bamboo forest wearing a suit of armor. His gut was screaming at him. Every instinct he had was firing, but he made the mistake a lot of experienced operators make. He chalked it up to fear, told himself it was just nerves, and that the situation was under control. The gunship doesn't see anything. Tactics are sound. Push through. The gunship called down. You're going to miss those guys. Turn northeast. So the team pivoted, except 3 of their men didn't hear the call. They were on the wrong radio frequency. The team split in 2 without realizing it. Eventually, when they figured it out, they stopped, took a knee. The interpreter flagged it. The guys aren't with us anymore. Now Redmond had 2 maneuvering elements and an unknown enemy force, and his people were separated in vegetation so thick they couldn't see 10 feet in front of them. So they made the call and decided to push out of the vegetation into the open, relink on the edge and approach from the north. As Redmond moved toward the tree line, Luke the medic stepped on something. Luke's boot landed on something that wasn't ground. It was an enemy fighter, buried in the vegetation. The man rolled, reached for his weapon. Luke shot him where he lay. Then the world erupted. What the gunship had identified as 5 men was actually 12 to 15 fighters arranged in an L-shaped ambush line, 5 yards back, facing north. They'd been waiting. Their leader had probably been in the building the SEALs had raided earlier and moved here to sleep, with his security element set up to catch vehicles or helicopters in a kill zone. The SEALs had come in from the south, behind the ambush line, and the fighters had been disciplined enough not to engage until the Americans walked into the kill zone. And eventually, they did. Bullets started flying. Luke the medic was hit first. He took a round below the knee, causing a compound fracture. The bone came through the skin and quite literally anchored him to the ground. He was screaming, pinned down. Matt, one of his teammates, sprinted forward, grabbed him, and dragged him behind the only cover available, a large tractor tire and a tree. Matt himself had been stitched across the leg and the arm, but he got Luke to cover anyway. Redmond was out front, laying down fire. That's when 2 machine guns turned on him. He was stitched across his body armor. 2 rounds taking out his left elbow, rounds off his weapon, rounds off his helmet. His left night vision tube was shot clean off. He turned to move back toward the tire. And that's when a round came from behind and hit him in the face. The bullet had entered in front of his right ear, traveled through his face, destroyed most of his nose, vaporized the floor of his eye socket, broke every bone above his eye, shattered the head of his jaw, and broke his jawbone all the way down to his chin. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. His team saw him fall, and they thought he was dead. Anyone would. But Redmond survived the shot to the face somehow. He doesn't know how long he was out, maybe 10 minutes. The gunfight continued, raged on without him. His team behind the tire and the tree, trading fire with an enemy they could only see as muzzle flashes 15 yards away, close enough to hear them reloading. When Redmond eventually came to, he was on his back. He could feel rounds passing over him, tracer fire, visible even through the blood in his eyes. He knew, do not sit up. At some point, in all the confusion, and he doesn't know why, he unclipped his helmet and took it off. Later, a round would punch through the forehead of that helmet, exactly where his skull had been. Another round hit his right side plate, the armor he almost hadn't worn. He never wore side plates on foot patrols. Too heavy. But that night, a quiet voice in his head had said, "Wear your side plates." He'd listened. That plate stopped a round that would have gone through his ribs and into his lungs. But still he was bleeding out. He tried to get his tourniquet on his shattered arm, but couldn't. He'd lost so much blood that he couldn't break the rubber bands holding the tourniquet to his kit. The thing designed to save his life was sealed by rubber bands his fingers didn't have the strength to snap. He was alone, 15 yards in front of his team, pinned in the open, and he understood. They couldn't come and get him. They had to win the fight first. Running into the open meant more casualties. He just had to wait. But Redmond didn't have a lot of time on his hands. He was dying. He knew the signs. He'd been trained to recognize them. Loss of feeling, cold spreading through his body despite the Iraqi heat, breathing getting harder, thinking getting harder. The darkness at the edges wasn't just the night, it was his body shutting down. He thought about his kids. He thought about never seeing them again. He would later say, "When you're dying, you don't think about your stuff. You don't think about your house or your car. All you want is to tell the people you love that you love them one more time." Jay, still taking fire from enemy insurgents, called in a fire mission from the gunship. But the gunship refused. They were too close. Well inside danger close parameters. A fire mission would kill friendlies. But Jay called again, and he was refused again. But Jay wasn't giving up. He needed air support, so he called for a third time. On the third call, Jay told them the truth. He said, "We are running out of ammunition. If you don't fire, nobody is going to be left." The gunship flying above asked for his JTAC number, the certification code proving he was authorized to call in airstrikes. They wanted it on record. If the rounds killed Americans, the blame would fall on him, not the gunship crew. He gave them the number without hesitating. The first 40mm round from the gunship hit the ground directly in front of Redmond, close enough that the blast threw dirt into his face, close enough that he felt the shockwave in his chest, but the machine guns in front of him went silent, and Jay sprinted forward, grabbed him by his gear, and dragged him behind the tire. When the medevac finally landed 75 yards away, Redmond refused to be dragged. He stopped Jay, told him, "Grab my arm and my helmet," because Redmond, in all the confusion of getting shot in the face, believed his arm had been shot off, and a SEAL doesn't leave his gear behind. Blood pouring from his face, one arm hanging useless, he walked to that helicopter. He grabbed the metal handle on the door of the Black Hawk with his one working hand, and the 160th Special Operations Flight Medics helped him inside. At the combat hospital, they cut off his gear, stripped everything, and a nurse found something that had been missed: a live fragmentation grenade, still in a pouch on his vest. She yelled, "He's still got a bomb on him!" Every doctor and nurse ran out of the operating room. Emergency protocol. Clear the space, and he lay there, bleeding, dying, and thought, "Oh my God, what a bad day." And that was the last thing Redmond remembered. By the time this mission started, the American sniper they called the Reaper, a ranger named Nick Irving, had already made a name for himself. 33 confirmed kills in a single 3.5-month deployment. He was operating out of a Ranger battalion in one of the most dangerous parts of Afghanistan, an area so hostile that the Marines who'd been there before them had given a simple warning: do not go in with anything less than a brigade. A brigade is a major tactical military unit of roughly 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers. The Ranger element going in that night had fewer than 35 soldiers. The plan was a targeted raid, assault a compound and capture a specific individual. Irving's team was tasked with setting up a blocking position in a field a good distance from the target building, covering an avenue of approach into the town. That night, the mission was a go. Nick's teams moved through the field on foot in the dark. As they walked, they noticed something odd. Craters in the ground, holes, not natural terrain features, like someone had dug fighting positions and let the grass grow over them. He looked back at his spotter and said something he wouldn't fully understand the importance of until later. If something goes wrong, we're coming back to these holes. They kept moving and set up their position overlooking a long road and the town beyond it. Dawn came and the town began to wake up. He took his night vision off to blend in with the terrain. The grass around them was waist high, enough to hide in, but only if he didn't move. He was scoped in when he saw a moped, 2 men on a small motorbike, heading toward the objective. Irving put his infrared laser on the driver's chest. The man couldn't see him in the grass, but he could see the red dot dancing on his shirt. He stopped the bike, looked down at his chest, looked up, directly toward where Irving was hiding. The expression on his face was pure hatred. The man turned the bike around and drove away. Irving turned to his spotter, Mike Pimenton, and said, "This isn't good." He had a bad feeling. And then, out of nowhere, in the distance, a huddle formed. Out in the open, a group of men gathered in a tight circle, like a football huddle. Irving watched through his scope. No visible weapons, but everything about their body language was wrong. They were looking around, scanning, planning. He called it into the recce team leader, a man he called Jay. He asked, "Can we engage these guys?" He was told no. No, due to no weapons being visible. So he continued to watch through his scope, and then the huddle broke. Like a quarterback clapping and the team scattering to their positions, the men split and moved in different directions. And less than 2 minutes later, the grass around them started being cut down. Not metaphorically. The grass was being moved by gunfire. Every direction, a full 360. The entire field erupted. Irving looked back at his spotter and the main element was already breaking contact. They made a sprint back toward the craters he'd spotted earlier, and 4 of them dove into the hole in the ground. Irving was the second man in the hole, Pimenton on top of him, Jay, then the recce team leader, below. Another operator sprawled flat on the rim. The fire was so intense, so heavy, that the dirt around the hole was being chewed to dust. Then the volume fire stopped, and a different sound replaced it. Single shots, evenly spaced. Precise, crack, pause, crack, pause, crack. Every shot was accurate, every movement anyone made drew fire. Irving understood instantly what was happening, and he remembered the Marine briefing from before the deployment. There's a Chechen sniper working in that area. He's been fighting since the Soviet days, and he has a significant kill record. It had to be him. Irving had identified a tall building, the only elevated structure with a clear line of sight to their hole. He zoomed in on it. If he were a sniper, that's where he'd be. Probably shooting from deep inside a room, back from the window, so only the muzzle and maybe a sliver of face were ever exposed. He went to lift his head for a better look, and crack. Around inches from his skull, Pimenton rolled over, crack. Dust kicked up next to his face. Then came the moment that nearly ended it. Irving and Jay rose up at the same time, their helmets almost touching, to try and get a shot off. A round passed between their heads. Not near them, between them. Close enough that the supersonic snap made them both flinch apart. The medic screamed. Who's hit? Who's hit?" Neither of them was. That went on for 3 hours. 3 hours in a hole in the ground, trading shots with a sniper who could see every twitch they made. Every time anyone moved, a round arrived. Precise, patient, professional. Around them, the enemy was closing in. They could hear footsteps, voices, the sound of men maneuvering for a final assault. Pimmonton started engaging fighters at close range with his .300 Win Mag sniper rifle, a weapon designed for targets hundreds of yards away, now being used at distances where you could see the whites of their eyes. Irving tried calling for airstrikes, begged for bombs, cursed out a colonel on the radio, something he'd never done in his life. The answer was no. Rules of engagement prohibited any strike with even a fraction of a % chance of collateral damage. The best they could offer was a show of force, a low flyover. So a fighter jet screamed overhead at low altitudes, but it did nothing. Then something appeared in the sky that Irving had never seen before in person. Thin, black-shaped like a disc. For a sleep-deprived, borderline hallucinating soldier, for a moment he thought it was a UFO. But it was a B-2 stealth bomber. Bay doors open. It dropped flares. But still, the enemy didn't care. At this point, Irving was losing hope. He looked at Jay, asked if he had a grenade. Jay already knew what he was thinking. If the enemy overran their position, they weren't going to be taken alive. They'd seen what happened to captured Americans in this part of the world, and they weren't going out like that. Jay pulled the grenade out. Irving fist-bumped his spotter, Mike Pimmonton, and they said their goodbyes. He told Mike, "Tell my wife I wasn't a coward." Mike looked at him and said, "I'm not telling her anything. She's Mexican. She'll cut me." Even in the worst moment of his life, they were still themselves. In that moment of sadness, Irving looked over his shoulder and saw something that his exhausted, dehydrated mind registered as a Road Runner cartoon. A cloud of dust kicking up from the ground like someone running impossibly fast. It wasn't Roadrunner. It was a machine gun team led by Corporal Eric in Ennis. It was Rangers from the main element. They'd heard the calls for help, and they were sprinting across open ground, carrying crew-served weapons, running directly into the fight. They popped smoke for cover, but the wind blew it in the wrong direction, so they had no concealment. So they just ran anyway. Irving told Mike to take the rear, and he'd lead them out. They bounded in pairs towards Ennis's machine gun team on the road. The Chechen sniper still taking shots as they ran, rounds kicking up dirt at their feet. They eventually made it to the machine gun team, and the first thing he asked for was water. He drank half the bottle, gave the rest to Mike. But the mission wasn't over. They still had to fight their way to the compound the main element had taken, and along the way, they skirted a tree line instead of going through it. A decision made from exhaustion, from wanting the shortest path to safety. A decision that would cost them. Around them, while skirting the tree line, the ground opened up. Fighters emerged from concealed spider holes, covered positions hidden under the grass, and ambushed them at point-blank range. They drove into a ravine, chest-deep water. In Ennis, the man who'd just sprinted across open ground to rescue them had his leg up on the embankment, laying down covering fire, and while doing so, in all the chaos around, found his femoral artery, causing unhealthy amounts of blood to leave his body. Irving described the water in the ravine turning dark and tasting like pennies. Irving grabbed the recce team commander and pulled him close to talk to his ear, screaming over the gunfire, "We have to move. 300 meters down this ravine, now." And as the words left his mouth, he felt a splash of warm liquid hit his face. The commander's body went weightless in his arms. A round had hit him in the chest, just above his body armor. The wound was open and raw. Pimmonton wasted no time, and with pure professionalism, put his hand directly into the wound to stop the bleeding. Their medic, a man named Melvin, was performing field surgery in chest-deep water, his medical kit floating around them. They carried the wounded down the ravine. At points, they had to submerge the stretcher to stay below the embankment for cover, holding a bleeding man underwater to keep him alive. They fought for 9 hours total. Irving started with 210 rounds. He finished with 6. At one point, the first sergeant passed the word, "If you have a knife, get ready. They might overrun us." But eventually the Marines finally arrived. But they were a mile away and refused to come closer. The only option was to run across a mile of open field, with a sniper still hunting them. Irving volunteered to lead the way, 6 bullets in his rifle, an open field, and a Chechen marksman who had been shooting at him for most of the day. They eventually made it to the Marines unharmed and piled 30 men into 4 Humvees, stacked on top of each other. On the way back, Irving asked a Marine for a cigarette, lit it, and when he was done, he flicked it out the hatch, only for it to land back inside and burn his back. He would later say that was the worst part of the whole day. Days later, Corporal Eric Innes, the man who'd been hit in the femoral artery, the machine gun team leader who had sprinted into the fight to rescue them, who didn't have to be there, who chose to run toward the sound of gunfire, died in the hospital. The first hospital lost power. They had to transfer him to another facility, and sadly, he didn't make it. Irving sat with the captured target before the helicopters came to take him away, leaned against his rucksack and closed his eyes for just a moment, and heard the crack of a bullet snap past his head. He jolted awake, looked around. Nobody else was reacting. The base was quiet, calm, waiting. The bullet wasn't real, but he could hear it as clearly as if the Chechen was still out there, taking one more shot. He knew then that something in him had broken, and some of it would never come back. Those are 5 real stories from men who lived through things most people can't imagine. Every mission was different, but every one of them shares something in common. Ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, who found out what they were made of when the world fell apart around them. If any of these stories hit you, and I know at least one of them did, leave a comment telling me which one. I read every single one. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.